What's going on, PGM fam? Welcome back to another episode. Thank you for joining us again today. We are halfway through May. Time is flying. And one of the things that Mike and I were thinking about, especially as we're moving into this election year, is we wanted to have and start having some conversations around, what's going on in our communities, what's going on a federal, national level, and so forth. And so today, we are joined by another special guest. We wanted to bring in someone who's in the field, Mr. Eddie Taveras. Eddie is a skilled political strategist specializing in campaigns, public engagement programs, policy advocacy, and government relations. But he's also very, very involved in the community. And so we want to shed some light on his story today and also shed light on some of his most recent accomplishments. But more importantly, we know that there's a lot of work that Eddie is doing here in the community. And so we're very excited to be having him for today's discussion. So Eddie, welcome to the show, my friend. How you doing?
Really good. Thank you for having me. As I noted, a little tired, but being tired is okay.
Hey, look, we all there. It's also we're airing today, but it is Monday, so we understand where everything's coming from. But look, man, we're very excited to have you on the show. And one of the things that Mike and I love to do every episode is we like to do a check-in. So we know you mentioned you're a little tired today. But we also know that there's been a lot of recent success for yourself. And there's been a lot of things that have been going on kind of your way. So we were hoping that we can start this episode one with a little bit of a check-in, just to gauge, see how you're doing physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, however you want to break it down, but also shed light on what's also going on in your world right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think I'm in the era of really taking down trying to understand where I am meant to go, and really sitting with what that means and giving it the opportunity to manifest into whatever that may be. And so, recently I made a chain in not career per se, but in roles that might take me to a different place along the lines. But being coming from a place where you're comfortable and know the day to day, I think that's sometimes it's scary, right? To go to the unknown. And given my economic background and social economic background, more precise, I don't have a social safety net, and so having to process that, and now going into this new position, still being scared of that, and so I'm
Mhm.
actually being trying to be very open about that with people, because I don't think it's something unique to me or unique to a person with my background. I think it's quite normal. And so I've been very open about that with my, partner, my friends, my family, etc. So that we can all, take that risk of investment in ourselves. And so hopefully it pans out, but if it doesn't, then at least I know I tried something.
Well, first off, congratulations on the new move. I know a lot of our audience is very in line with this around transitions, right? And we know they're not easy, but oftentimes, like we always say on this platform, it's the power of growth mindset, and it all starts with you. It does all start with you, especially when you start thinking about what is that next step in your careers, what is that leap of faith that you're taking to get you into the direction that you want to go or the places that you want to go. So appreciate you shedding light on that. What I do want to start off with this conversation, because we are on the idea of transitions. After doing some homework, this is not the first field that you started in. We know you're in the politics, you're in strategy, you're in reform, but we also heard that you may have started in fashion and you've also come from a few other backgrounds. So you're not new to transitioning. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired that move, and how some of those moments, some of those lessons that you had from that transition are also helping you with this transition currently.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting part because I always feel like we are always put in a box or siloed to do one specific thing or want to do one specific thing for for a really long time or forever. And so for me, I started in what most people say fashion, but to break it down is a department store. And so I
Mm,
worked for Barney's New York, which at the time no longer exists, but was a high specialty department store with emerging, high-end designer and some of the traditional ones that we all may know. But I also worked at, other stores like Ann Taylor, et cetera. And what was exciting for me was the opportunity to really try to engage and dissect a human being in very short amount of time. And really seeking why they came to the store and what they're seeking and how I can help them, and
Hmm.
how I can make them sort of like feel better about themselves in a very short amount of time. Some I've, see I would have seen from time to time. Others will be my one and only interaction. And so being able to apply some of my, interpersonal skills to figure out what they were looking for and make them feel better was quite, a very high moment for me. In addition to, I like to operationalize things, and so I always think of things of process. So, a strategy is as great as is implementation, and so I really think about in those kind of forms. And so, working in the fashion field in retail, that really culminated my interest, right? As a creative, looking at obviously wonderful clothes, but like the artistry of making those clothes and the technicalities that goes into, a garment and how the different fabrics kind of molded together, that was great for my creativity side. For my technical sides, making like I really focused on floor operations. And so seeing how a customer, once they walked into that floor, really experience the floor, experience the people, and how can we guide them to certain places, right? So if a brand was doing not so good, how do we guide that person into that, and how do we pique their interest there? But I did have an interest to try to help others, and I wanted to make sure that whether I go back to it later in life, I wanted to make sure that I did my best to try to make an impact and try to pay it forward to, you know, the opportunities that I received, given where my family is from.
Hmm. That's amazing. That's amazing. So I guess my follow-up question from that is, you mentioned that you made the switch from fashion, you wanted to do something more impactful. Um, as you made that switch to doing something more impactful, like what drove some of that push, right? Like you just mentioned your family. So I wonder if there was an experience or something that just kind of drove you to be like, nope, this is it. This is what I want to do. This is why I want to make the switch. Like, can you touch a little bit more on that for us?
Yeah, and this I've been thinking about like what is the theme of this of that switch, but of this like, current pathway and or lane in the highway that I'm at. And I think it's healing, right? Like that's the adjective, healing. Um and when I look at my family dynamics, my grandmother came from the Dominican Republic to the U.S., New York City to be exact, in the 70s. She was here undocumented, and there was that meant that for my mom, who was her first child, that meant that she, you know, from age 12 to essentially age 18, there was no connection to, my grandmother, my mom, and her. And it's the 70s, they were poor, and so while phone existed, it was very every once in a while you kind of had to know somebody who had a cell phone. And so the only way they could really connect is through what my grandmother sent her.
Hmm.
um and I didn't know this until later on when I it was all three of us in a room, and I kind of said, what's the issue between what's this tension that I see and have experienced? And it was more that, whatever my grandmother could gather and send her, um, it never got to her.
Hmm.
And so you have the culminating 6 to 7 years apart where the only affection and affirmation you can receive is through a material thing that my mom never received. Now, this was about 6 years ago that we were able to discover this, by me just asking a question. Um, Luckily, the good side of the story is that they have a much stronger and better relationship. But unfortunately, there's still some hurt, and there's still some generational trauma that has been passed down to me. And I can very much, point to it. Like I'm not an expressive person in terms of how I express love to other people. but I do things that illustrate that. So I'm big on time. I'm big on gift giving. I'm big on all these other things, but not the verbalization of it. And that's because of my mom and her traumas and her journey of healing, right? Where I know my mom loves me. And that was very apparent, but it was very apparent how she did it and how she wanted to receive love, given the circumstances of, that family separation aspect. And so that really led me to really try to, figure out how can I make sure that that doesn't occur. Obviously, there are different spectrums of the story, and so this is kind of what led me into really focus on immigration later in life. Once I made the switch from retail, I did a political campaigns, and then I was really focused on immigration for about 5.5 years. Is to try to figure out what is that bridge, because we forget about the trauma, the impact, and then the healing process that, in my mom case, has been taking, for decades.
Hmm. Hmm.
Eddie, you mentioned the healing process, and I know everyone healing journey is completely different. I know at the beginning of the episode you also talked about that, and I was curious if you're open to sharing that process and what it looks like for you. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it towards the mid part of the episode, but I hear healing a lot, and so can you tell us what does that look like for you now, and also for your family?
Yeah, it's for me, it's being more present and being more intentional about the relationship I've held and hold, um, and really trying to change my actions and taking in the feedback. And
Hmm.
so I am a person that if you call me, I'll figure out a way to be there and show up. If I can, I will let you know. But
Hmm.
I have to be called upon to do that. Where and that's very burdensome to people who don't operate like me. And so I have had to learn that because I care deeply about my friends, my fiance, who she's very different from me, and others, I've had to learn how to do that, right? And it sounds a little robotic. And to some extent, it feels a little robotic, to be quite honest. But it is a thing. It is in order for me to heal from that, I need to be able to show up as a human being in full self, not in the way I just want to, but in the way others expect of me. And so there's always this, balance on how do you do that and how do you do it authentically. And, I'm not going to sit here today and tell you I have it figured out. I don't. Sometimes I'm great at it, other times I fail. And so, but it is a constant um, challenge to myself based
Hmm.
on feedback I've received from friends and close and loved ones. I would say for my family, my mom has been more verbal about saying I love you, for instance, in my later years. I'm in my 30s. And to some extent that still feels like weird to hear. She said it throughout my young years, but it hasn't been consistent. And sometimes I hesitate to say it. And I'm still trying to figure out why this is, and why can my feelings connect to the verbalization and the definition of that? I don't have an answer to you for you today, but I think that's part of my journey to figure out what that is and be more comfortable about being loving. I do believe that words carry meaning,
Hmm.
and so you know there's no one I love more than my mom and grandmother, and my fiance. And so why does it feel different when I tell one of them versus the other, when I still hold them in very high regards, and particularly my mom?
Mhm. No,
I hear that. Go ahead,
I
Eddie.
appreciate. Yeah, I was gonna say I appreciate it, and I say that because I think I've heard similar situations from other friends of mine. And I would even argue, I've experienced that in my own life, in my own house. And, it's one of those things where I know everybody, how they take and receive love is totally different. And that's something that we all have to break down and figure out for ourselves. But, there's always the attempt, the action, and figuring it out. And I know that's something that I constantly am struggling with and figure out. But at the end of the day, we make it work. We make it work.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to transition a little bit, and I want to ask you because you're doing a lot of great things in the community. And when you start thinking about, your upbringing and what inspired you to get started in what you're doing now, it sounds like a lot of that was motivated and still based off of what happened during your childhood. Um, and and I wonder, as you are, you've started this new role, you've been in the space for a while. I can imagine that there's a lot of uphill climbs that you have to deal with. I can imagine that, you know, it's as we kind of look at what's going on politically, there's a lot of different sides. Everybody's got their own idea of like what's right, what's wrong. But at the end of the day, we also know that we're trying to work through this as a country. So I wonder, in your space, as you're thinking about immigration reform, what are some of those things? What are some of those challenges that you're facing individually with being in the role? But then I would also ask you too, as we start thinking about this, we always say like other folks can get involved. So I guess my question to you also is, how are you empowering other folks to get involved as well?
Yeah. This is like a culminating thing when you work in politics,
Yep.
and particularly, the political dynamics and polarization that is occurring, has occurred. Um, one of the things that I've been very careful of, is making sure I don't lose my humanity in the
Mm-hmm.
process of trying to dehumanize somebody else. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that is that it this is not to justify other people's action, but it is to understand
Mm-hmm.
where that, whether it's anger or hate or difference in opinions, is coming from. And I've been fortunate enough to work in spaces and places, um, whether it's employment or otherwise, that really has forced me to try to seek that understanding in a way that doesn't dehumanize the other person. Um, and I always note this story. I was doing a race in Utah. For those who don't know, it's a very conservative state, um, though many lovely people. And in one of the campaign events I had, I was having this lovely conversation with this individual, um, who, was Republican, white, all the demographics that one may think of and want to attach. But we were having this like lovely conversation, and finding commonalities throughout the ways. But for the fact that everything he stood for was against my existence. And I mean it in the sense of the word. This is an individual that, I would still personally, if I was sitting in the street, likely say hi to him, like, maybe have a beer or a drink or something. But for the fact that everything he was saying, it was just like he didn't see me, right? He knew that he was having a great conversation with this person and that it wasn't polarizing or too contentious, but I still wasn't seen, and it could have been very easy for me to have anger, and I don't blame people who develop that or have that, right? Um, but I chose not to view it and perceive it in that way because the effect it would have on me more than on him,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so in me and I made that personal choice, in me holding that or getting angry, it wouldn't affect his life in any kind of way, right? But it would have affected mine. And so what I tried to do, and to be like, and I say this in quotation, a strategist or a good advisor to, X person or X campaign, you have to be able to dissect and be able to know where the opportunity lies. And the
Mm-hmm.
only way to do that clearly is to be able to see where the commonalities are versus where the, differences live. It sounds kind of cliche, but it's quite effective where you're not focusing on the differences and you can focus on what are the foundational values that we have, where we can start a conversation. It may not lead to a solution today, tomorrow, or even ever, but it could lead to some understanding and level of respect that I think we lack today.
Mm.
In a perfect world, that sounds wonderful. I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
I love that, and it's very tactful as well. So, but how do you, can you speak a little bit more about that? Because how do you go about, I understand it's strategizing, right? But at the same time, the level of poise and the level of attention to detail and the level of maturity that one would need to have in order to actually respond in such a way that it's not going to be disrespectful, shall I say? How do one work towards that?
In all honesty, I don't know. I don't know because there are
Mm,
times where I want to like scream and shout and like,
yeah.
I don't want to curse here, but where I'm like, F this, right? Like, there's no point. Um, but then it becomes a point of like, okay, so so when do we get to like some type of comparable
Mhm.
space? And this is not to say that moderation is key everywhere. I think in the space that I am in how I choose to make an impact,
Hmm.
that is where my lane is.
Hmm.
But I have deep respect, whether it, and I always say like Gen Z get a lot of flack, but I have deep respect for Gen Zers and how they're leading with this level of moral clarity that I think dictates to folks like me, right? What can happen and
Hmm.
what should happen, and what are the big kind of conceptualized idea in I guess a more perfect world or more perfect union that we can create, right? And so I'm very sensitive to understand that I don't have all the answers and I
Hmm.
can
Hmm.
only do the best that I can, but while I'm there, I will seek to learn and I will seek to implement
Mhm.
things and in ways that has made it better than when I first came into the situation, problem, etc.
Peacemaker. I love it.
Yeah.
But
Maybe. Yeah.
nah. But like I said, but you're doing it in a way where you, at the end of the day, you are trying to, some people say play the game, but at the same time, you're doing it in a way where you're able to get your goal accomplished in a way that, in a sense, it is playing the game essentially.
Mhm.
Yeah, just I mean, it just to a lot of extent, I guess I should say, it is kind of like playing the game because again, just seeing where trying to figure out what my calling
Hmm.
is and how I can be the
Hmm.
most effective and efficient person.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
I just feel like I have a moral and ethical and professional obligation, right, to the community I'm seeking to serve. And if I can't deliver something that makes their life that much better or that much closer to, whatever the North Star or objective is, then, I consider that a personal failure to me. It's not
Hmm.
always possible to have those change, but if I can get closer to that change, I feel like I have an obligation to try to seek it and
Hmm.
try to accomplish it. Um, folks disagree, and I'm sure folks have
Absolutely.
disagreed with me in my personal philosophy, but it's understanding, and this is also what grounds me in the work that I do and the partners of all kind of both political spectrum, is that we may have different methods, but we have the same goals,
Mhm.
right? And so in understanding that I still want my people to be free, I think that is where I've normally been able to gain trust um, with partners, colleagues, etc. Is because we have the same foundational mission, but how we get there may look different, and I don't think
Absolutely.
they have to be in conflict. I think they can be
Absolutely.
in parallel with each other, and so that's kind of where I found myself most effective. But I respect other people's work, and I think it's necessary to have. Um, you know, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that level of intensity, I feel like that's important.
Mm. I appreciate that perspective. Well, as you were kind of talking, I think that there's two things that kind of came up for me. One, I feel like we miss the opportunity to show a little bit of empathy. And that's whether it's on the political space, that's whether it's day to day, you trying to figure out something with a friend. Like we kind of missing that. And then I think the other thing too is, as you kind of talked about it, is kind of like taking that step back
Hmm.
and how do you walk in somebody else's shoes to get an understanding of where they're coming from, so that way we can move the needle a little forward. Whether we may not agree on everything, but
Hmm.
we do know that at the end of the day we are trying to do what's best for a group, a party, people, et cetera, right? So I wonder, and this is more just natural curiosity, but when we start looking at the space that you're in, strategic partnerships, I would assume are a very big deal because that's something that we deal with in the corporate space. So I wonder, as you're trying to drive some of that change, how important is it, that you do, whether you're working with another political party or working with another group to help move that needle forward? Like, how important is that? And if you could talk a little bit more on that, that would be great.
It's critical
Mm.
in all we do. And I just to be clear, when I'm extending grace, I'm not extending the grace to to the folks who are like, would like to not see me exist. I know I gave a very extreme um, example. So partnership is what it's literally how you build a coalition, right? Of multitudes. And so I think this is where it has served me the most, right? When we're talking about businesses, who care about, for instance, on immigration, right? They care about this. Why they care about it, you know, sure, for some that may be like a critical moral thing. For
Hmm.
me, you know, is it gonna get me closer to my North Star, right? And this doesn't mean you kind of take all or like don't mitigate risk, right? Like and accept everybody's help. But this is to understand how you can best utilize those other stakeholders that have credibility elsewhere. And so I've been able to really, you know, root on some of the campaigns that I've led or been part of, etc., where we use those folks as a way to tell a different story and as a way to show, how this is, for instance, on immigration, how this is beneficial beyond, the morality aspect, the community aspect, the family aspect, but also the economic aspect. And because these folks have a clear directive, their bottom line, right? And so if their conversation and highlight of, like, for instance, labor, needing more labor, is a way to get more supporter who may not otherwise understand,
Hmm.
what we all get here on on this conversation, you know, then let that be. And but it's a tricky situation just because even working with corporate partners, given their bottom line, and if they're like, a statewide base, national base, or international base, those all have layers to how much they're willing to get involved. And so you have to be able to seek and see the opportunity and clearly distill it to make it easy for them. And when you're seeking those opportunity, mitigate some of the harms that could happen to them, right? And
Hmm.
it's an unfortunate as an advocate that I have to now think about how to mitigate, multi-billion dollar corporations, visibility or perception. But in order to get what I want, that's some of the work that I need to do as, a strategist or an advocate for my community. And so I'm willing to do those things, if it means that at the end results, I can deliver for my community, and obviously with some harm reduction and mitigation perspectives there.
I appreciate you for bringing that up because, as we are in roles that we are seen as the advocate or we put in positions to be the advocate, how do you find that balance between, hearing the chaos right out that goes on within the world that we live in and trying to find a balance of saying, you know what, Yes, I'm here to advocate. Yes, I'm here to do all that I can to continue to move the needle. How do you find that balance between being that strategist and understanding the role and understanding how critical partnerships are, as compared to, as sometimes, while it is our hope and it's our goal to not cause harm, but also, in a sense, hold those who are causing harm to those communities, hold them accountable. How do you find that balance? Because I know sometimes it's hard, and I know sometimes it takes being strategic. But can you speak to us about that and what that process is like from your perspective?
Yeah. And it's not to say that what I do and how I apply, my perspective is like more strategic or
Right,
less.
right,
It's
right.
just to say it's one of the many ways
Right. Absolutely.
that could be shown success. It's very difficult um to find that balance of figuring out who are the great partners and how do you hold them accountable to the greater things. One of the things that I started to learn is that, what I do is enough. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the times, Black and Brown people are given this or feel like they must solve everything and take on everything for our people. Um, and part of it, sure, we will and we do. A lot of it is imposed on us, and a lot of it just comes from, us having the experience, that we've experienced in this
Mhm.
uh, white-led society. But I think it's important to know that we're here for such a short amount of time,
Absolutely.
and that we are also deserving of love, happiness, wealth, if that's what you're seeking, fame, whatever that is, whatever happiness is means and essentially manifests in your life, you are deserving of that. And so for me is really trying to give myself the grace and give myself the understanding that I won't be able to solve the world's problem, my
Mhm.
people's problem, my community's problem, but I can make it better, or I can seek to make it better, and that is enough,
Mhm.
right? And because it has to be enough, right? Because I don't believe we should live in perpetual cycles of distress, of the world is on fire. I mean, it literally is on fire, but collectively we can pick that up. But individually, we got to stop this notion that, you know, we ourselves can fix it.
Mhm.
And so I try to break down that kind of thinking, not just within myself, but within my close, circle, for lack of a better word, of saying what you're doing is enough, and that's all you could do.
Mhm.
And so long as you do that, you know, the world has an opportunity to be a better place, but it's not up to me or you or anyone else. It's up to the collective forces to figure that out.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that. So, can you talk to us about the many controversial topics that's been talked about as it relates to protection for immigrants, and what are some key factors that could be used to improve advocacy and accountability efforts?
Yeah, so. We, as a global society, we've always had this issue of displacement and migration.
Hmm.
As it comes to the U.S., obviously you see that kind of in waves, but to keep it short, contextually, um, we're having a vast amount of displacement within the Western Hemisphere. So the Americas, North America, South America, in high numbers that we've never seen before.
Hmm.
Part of it is, unstable democracies or lack thereof, or authoritarian regime, natural disaster, climate change, economic needs, violence that has been occurring, etc. And so what you're seeing is that a lot of that is culminating at the same time
Hmm.
and in highly distressed populated area, but within a specific unique areas within the Americas. And so you're starting to you have seen the increase of people seeking refuge, seeking, quite frankly, the American dream, which America has very much PR'd it very well to the world. Um, but where that changes is that you're starting to see a lot of women, a lot of children, a lot of family unit, and a lot of also non-traditional folks that would have normally migrated from it are now starting to migrate, that speak different dialects. For instance, you'll have a lot of indigenous folks from Central and Latin America. You have a lot of folks that look different, right? Racially, ethnic wise, ethnicity wise. And when you, and from different countries as well that don't have an established community here that normally receives it. So, like, my grandmother came to New York City, but there was already established, like, Puerto Rican, who are not immigrants, but there's a similarity in culture, and then Dominicans, right? And so she was able to be integrated fairly quickly. That's not the same things that it has been happening, for instance, for a large portion of Venezuelans, a large portion of indigenous folks that are coming from Central America. Haiti, for instance, there has been populations of Haitians throughout the decades here, but large quantity, you're starting to see more of that. And then also from other continents that are coming in, particularly from like West Africa, some country in Southeast Asia as well, that are coming in. And so these are all culminating factors, that makes it difficult. And so when you're thinking about immigrant, they're looking very different. They're speaking in different dialects or language. And so you start to see this undertone of, colorism and white supremacy really taking a hold in not just the narrative, but also in how we spread our resource and assist. And so this is part of like the culminating issue. Obviously, there's a lot of policy involved, but I'm going to keep that aside for this conversation. This is one of the underlying issues that you see, between communities, in between U.S. Political spectrum. And I always note this. I think we were able to resettle more than 100,000 Ukrainians, and rightfully so. We should have been taking them in and resettling them, with no fuzz. I'm sure you haven't seen any specific bad issues with them. But when it comes to resettling Haitians or Mauritanians, or even certain Central Americans, you start to see the issue and the dynamics, right? You saw very vividly during the previous administration, or I believe it was during this administration. Current apologies. The very vivid image of, I believe it was a border patrol, in a horse with a whip, right? Like, these are interesting, triggers, I think, for my community and our people, our collective people, in how we are thinking about this issue, beyond just like the other, and how it culminates into the historical nature of this country, that we've been so long fighting for it, and somehow in the last, few years, it feels like we've kind of taken a step back by several decades, and where certain things, that have always existed were kind of noted in passive aggressive undertone, are now very vividly being noted and portrayed by presidential candidates, and former presidents, and so those are huge challenges, that really makes the work in immigration very complex, and that is really hard to dissect and sit with and have a fruitful conversation, right? Because in the midst of all that, there's also just generational failed policy that creates a sense of, chaotic and disorder, that is actually quite man-made, right?
Wow, man, that's a lot to unpack. And I acknowledge, I acknowledge many emotions and many feelings that that was provoked for me as you were speaking. But two, it's just like, this is not something that I don't know. And when I'm oftentimes in spaces, it's just like, wow, that's my truth. That's not a lot of other people's truth. And it's just like, okay, at what point do I say, okay, enough is enough, and like let me continue to apply more pressure, apply more effort to be able to, in a sense, not end everything, but to make better, and to the point that you mentioned earlier. So with that understanding of the current political climate, and also understanding how DEI has been under attack in a sense, and its impact on public policy, social issues, immigration, ethnicity, all of the above, basically. Can you talk to us about what are some ways that we can do to support this current political climate? And when I say we, I'm talking about the community, right? And regardless of where each individual fall in, whether it's impacted through education, gender equity issues, ethnicity, immigration.
It's a really hard one. Uh, you know, I think it starts young, to be quite honest, and it starts with a personal philosophy and a personal way of viewing the world and viewing not just an acceptance. You know, I don't want somebody just to accept me. I want somebody to actually respect me,
Mm,
um, and that comes whether you disagree with that person or not. And I think you know the attack, and particularly on diversity, equity, and inclusion is a form of what I see like white supremacy really doing what it does, which it's really threatened, it really figures out a way to dismantle whatever has been working, right? And we saw that with the Voting Act. We've seen that with like school integration, right? Like we can say all these things. At the end of the day, we're still very much segregated, economically, socially, and even within communities. And and so that's very hard. I think policies are, to me, is it's kind of a band-aid, and it's kind of a reminder of a failed, it's not system, it's just a failed society, right? That we have to put these mechanisms in place to be able to hold ourselves accountable. And quite frankly, they don't really work. And so where can we do that work is making sure that it's a personal belief, right? I I've always said that, for me, I don't need a policy to tell me not to do wrong, right? I can know that. Now, are policies helpful in directing, that? Sure. But the fact that I can accept certain things is because I believe them. And I think that is the key that it's missing. I don't have the answer for that, but it's like it's that belief in that so that we wouldn't have to always continuously to fight. And, you know, at some point even potentially lose that, whether it's the DEI, but we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about reproductive health rights. These are things that we have lost to some extent, depending on where you live, your socioeconomic, whatever. And so we have to figure out a way of how do we make sure that communities are believing, and how are we actually having conversations with each other about hard stuff where we
mhm,
don't always agree, because that is the other thing. We sit within the bubble that we live in, and that is very easy and quite honestly understandable and logical, right? To stand within that. But I think for, and particularly my white counterparts, there's a lot of work that needs to be had. There's a lot of work that needs to be had within particularly their own communities that I cannot take on, nor can I fix. And so I'm going to need that extra support from, noted allies or noted people who are trying to do better. I need
mhm,
them to be better, but I need
mhm,
that work to start in their community, not in mine.
mhm,
You touch base on something that we want to. I've got a follow-up question because I think that this is pretty important. But you had mentioned that we can have these conversations, right? We can talk about what needs to be done, but talking about it and then being about it are two different things. So I wonder, as we kind of go back to the community piece, right? We can have these conversations in our community. We can host town halls, but there's more that needs to come out of that. So I wonder, especially as we're starting to see the shift and and not even a shift, but we're revisiting things that we thought that we wouldn't have to deal with in 2024. But the reality is we are. Um, what role and how important is it going to be that the community plays a role in driving change? But then also when it comes to advocacy, what is the role that we can have to ensure that we are actually moving the needle forward as a group? Because it can't just be one person. It's got to take a community to do it. So if you could touch on that.
Yeah, and I don't pretend to be, and I'm not like an organizer. I think that's a
He made
specific,
that loud and clear. Do not come on him. He is not an organizer.
I'm not an organizer. And I say that with
Uh,
the utmost humility for that type of work, because that is really hard work. That is very skillful work. And it takes a level of, emotional intelligence, beyond what one may interact on a day to day, to really reach people at that level, and start that work there. And so I'm always at all and, again, try to take whatever cues I can from folks who are doing that on the ground, who are leading that. What I say is like you have to build power building by building kind of, and you've seen it done, during the civil rights era. You've seen it done in particularly in movement of like, tenant union, etc., where you get a collective group of people that you know, are about the fight and because it affects them directly and they can see results right away. And in order to see that, you have to start at the local level. And I always say that one thing, having been doing federal work for a minute, people that are doing federal work kind of lose that sensibility that the fight is actually in the states. The fight it starts in the community. And when you disconnect from that to kind of like, the federal thing where I have, that's where the problem begins because there's a huge misconception. And honestly, there's a prestige about federal work that I don't know why is there because you can get more things done locally, city and statewide. And so one of my most rewarding thus far career experience has been working in the States and being able to see the fruit of my work in partnership with other folks that have gotten and delivered for my community. And so nothing is too small. And quite frankly, the smaller things are the biggest things, when it comes to, I think, making a change. And when it comes to ideas and innovation, that's where it starts. And so that's what I would kind of say. It's like we need to start building from from the bottom up. And I think we've taken this a little too Reaganish, where we believe in this trickle down effect. It hasn't worked, it won't work. And so I take that perspective very seriously. And then the other thing is we have to start prompting people up who are non-traditional. And when I say non-traditional is whether it's school board, state council, etc. I think we have this archetype that is still being propelled by, social norms and the respectability of politics that I think we have to break down. I've seen obviously some inroads, in particular with the younger generation, but it doesn't have to be like an age thing. You know, I think my grandmother would be an amazing city council person. I truly believe that. I think my mom, who's been here for quite some time, understands the value of, for instance, being a freelance worker as a bartender, right? Those are experiences I don't have. And in the way that I've seen my grandmother, and particularly my mom, solve things, you know, without the accolades of degrees and stuff like that, but nevertheless outsmarting everybody in the room, it puts me at all. And so I would like to see the non-traditional types of community leaders, particularly women, Black and brown women who have been leading but have not been given the space. And so that is like a clear way that I think we can make a huge impact, more effectively and efficiently.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Especially as it relates to how much impact the local level have on
Hmm.
making quicker, I shall I say, change within the communities that you live in. And I also will add the fact that some people, I think they understand everything that you just said. However, many have lost hope, especially like when you look at different policies that have been put in place and then they have been undone. For example, I won't go too deep into it, but how like some of the Confederate statues are beginning to make their way back onto many campuses. And so for a lot of people who fought against that and were able to see the change and now to go look now on the news or wherever you get your information from, and see, wow, we're back where I started. And so it's just like, how do I not lose hope and continue to fight and continue to speak out and not be loud and wrong and continue to educate myself, right? So that I'm able to not only help support change, but also help educate in a means where I'm providing accurate information. So I just want to appreciate, well, one, affirm what you just said, and then two, just kind of reiterate, sometimes people do lose hope, but I guess I'm asking you a question, like, how have you seen and how do you encourage people who have lost hope to don't quit?
From my experience, I think people who look like me or, come from, I guess, more oppressive um, background is
Mhm.
sometimes we don't sit and celebrate the wins.
Mm,
And we are in a perpetual cycle of fighting, you know, at different levels, at the highest is literally for your life. Um, and yet there are many times where we have made, change that are not insignificant, and
mhm,
we're very quick to brush over it because it didn't meet our North Star, it didn't meet all our goals.
mhm,
And whatever fight we choose to be in or have been chosen to be in, right? That is an unfortunate reality. That is a fight that's going to outlive us. And so this is where I go back to giving yourself enough grace to know that what you do is enough and has to be enough, right? Um, because without that, you just have a void of hopelessness, and we deserve better than that. And I go back to what I said: we deserve to be happy, we deserve to be loved, we deserve
mhm,
to heal, we deserve all those things that has never been really afforded to us and still isn't afforded to us. But in the moments when it is, in the moments when we win something, I think it's worth celebrating because we were never meant to win, right? We live in a society, in a system where it is stacked against, and particularly Black people, from winning. And so when those things occur, we have to sit with it, we have to digest it, we have to realize the effort that was made for us not to succeed, and yet we did, in order for us to, not be burnt out, because we are always constantly, trying to change the world, instead of trying to change our world, as a singular. And I want to be clear, this is not to, it's not that we're not collectively in this fight. We are, and we will always be part of this collective fight, but it does just also mean that we are also human and we have limitations.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Eddie, I appreciate you for being a part of our show today. We talked about a lot of great things and some things I know that our listeners would definitely will be able to take and process and be able to apply to their worlds. And I like the individual perspective that you brought to the last statement that you made, where not focusing on necessarily changing the world, but being able to understand that you can change yourself in a sense. And I do believe, and I said it today, is this something that I can control? And we can't control changing the world, but we can control changing ourselves. And we always say it's like small steps equals growth, but in reality, that's the truth. But before we close, we have a question that we didn't share with you, and it's a question just to kind of see um, where you are and your thinking and how you process things. There is really no right or wrong answer, but would you rather continually embrace challenges and potential setbacks, or would you rather consistently avoid challenges to maintain a more predictable and comfortable lifestyle?
Knowing that I'm so knowing that I've recently went to it's a hard one. That I recently went to a change and with tremendous risk factor in terms of, economic mobility, etc. The former. I think, if you can, you should try to seek that challenge, and seek those opportunities and that new level of like intellectual curiosity if that's where it's leading you. Um, and so for me, it's like a clear decision, though a very hard and complex thing to know that what the right
Mhm.
answer is, in our current span of life. Talk to me 40 years from now, I'll tell you if I change my mind.
Before we close with that, Eddie, you're doing a lot of great things, and how can people who are interested in supporting you and also
Hmm.
following your journey, how can those individuals stay in contact with you or follow you on social media if the information is public?
Yeah, not that I write much interesting things, but you can follow me on Twitter at Eddie Eddie Taveras. Um, you can use that Eddie Taveras, and also check me out on LinkedIn. Um, but if I could be of service, by all means, please reach out. I'm all about opening doors, and figuring out how to make sure that, whether I decide to exit at some point, exit or end my journey, I'm bringing people along with me. So by all means, reach out.
For again, I know Mike kind of reiterated it, but we're thankful for the time today. We're thankful to have you on the platform and of course to come talk to our audience. I know that there's a lot of stuff that we can dissect, and there's a lot of things that we can break down, but I think the key and a lot of from at least from what I was hearing was one, of course, change takes time. But on the flip side to it, of course, as we always say, it takes a collective effort. And I think going back to what Mike was saying as he summarizes, at the end of the day, and as we always say, it does start with you. So regardless of where you're at or you are at in your journey, whatever impact that you're trying to make on yourself or your community, give yourself that grace, give yourself some time to heal, but also give yourself an opportunity to challenge yourself and go after it, wherever whatever that may look like for you. But at the end of the day, as we always say on this platform, it's the power of a growth mindset, and it always starts with you.